Okay, well, I guess we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Code Talk Teach, our kind of technology talk show. I'm Kyle Cordes at Oasis Digital. Paul?
Paul Spears.
Lance Finney, also with Oasis Digital.
And I guess our format, as always, to kind of talk about some news of the week, small stuff for 5-10 minutes. And then we have our big topic today, which I promise we'll get to, is we've had a lot of thoughts about how to start a project. Big, small, web tech, otherwise. But we'll get to that after the kind of news of the week. So what's going on? I guess the big one for me is that NGConf, of which we are a sponsor, is in 2 days. I'm going to attend. Are either of you attending?
Yeah, I'm planning to attend, and it's a virtual attendance, of course, but I plan to attend. I have a couple, well, actually now it's down to just one client meeting on Thursday, so I'll have to juggle with that, but otherwise I plan to be keeping focus.
So I saw in their announcement email that if you're in the event, you can watch the replays like right after they happen. And so after the event, you have to wait for them to land on YouTube eventually. But during the event, if you just miss one, you can just go back and watch it like whenever.
Yep, that is my plan this year, is to catch the YouTube track.
Yeah, it's just so hard to argue with. Wait and see what was good, what got attention, wait for it to land on YouTube, then watch it at a convenient time on 1.75x or whatever your personal tolerance is. But I mean, I think the last one got like 1,000 people attending live online.
Well, that was a year ago, and that was right when the pandemic was starting, and so I think there was a lot of curiosity about how this whole thing was going to work because it was a kind of a last-minute scramble to even get the thing running at all. Now we've been in this life for a year, and maybe people are more familiar with this sort of thing and there won't be as much excitement, or maybe there's just going to be a whole lot of hunger for this sort of interaction with the Angular community. So maybe it's going to be a huge crowd. I have no idea which way it's going to go.
Well, I've quasi-attended numerous online conferences, online meetups, and that kind of thing over the last year plus now. And I would say that the overwhelming majority do a not very good job of capturing really any of the energy of being there for the in-person interaction. It turns out to be very, very difficult to capture that online. And I would say beyond just that it's difficult, a great number of events don't even make the slightest attempt, or they make literally just the slightest attempt. I think the NGConf crowd, I think they've been experimenting with platforms. Like they're trying to like use a platform, find a platform that recaptures that interaction. I've been to events that are just a video playback that happens live and a chat that doesn't work very well, that no one uses, where there's basically no interaction at all. I've been to ones where there's a chat that is just buzzing with energy the whole time. I've been to a couple with platforms that like have you click around in a virtual space as if you were walking around a conference venue, and that works just as badly as it sounds like it would. I don't know. I think there's a lot of pent-up demand for in-person events, really. What do you think?
Yeah, I am looking forward to traveling again, but in general, like, my family has been a lot more cautious than a lot of other families. My kids are both studying from home, and my wife and I are both working from home. So just getting into a plane and interacting with thousands of people in the same room, it's just going to kind of be a culture shock at this point, even though it was something I was so used to previously. So.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, for reasons not worthy of this video podcast, we are, my family has been kind of required, unfortunately, for medical reasons to be excessively careful, but we are now of sufficient age to be fully vaccinated and ready to participate in the world again. Speaking of participating in the world, I think we read that Strange Loop, hometown St. Louis favorite conference, is planned to be happening in person this fall. I haven't made it to, I think, the last 3 years, but I think I might go to this one. And I'm kind of wondering if the people that put on in-person events are going to find that the kind of the yield from emailing every past attendee and saying, hey, we're doing it again, you want to come, might be like shockingly high. There might be a lot of people like me who skipped the last few years just for whatever reasons, because something else is going on of some event, and then it comes back, and a higher than usual percentage say, yeah, I haven't been that in a few years. I think I'm going to go. I think that like the next NGConf, don't they usually do a fall event? They do like a fall enterprise event. I don't know if that'll be in person.
I think it was the first time.
Yeah, I don't know what their plans are in terms of whether to do a second in-person event each year, but I assume that the next in-person one would have to be next year. But by then, the sort of rush of excitement might have tempered a bit when we all remember how unpleasant it is to like slog through an airport. That's one of those things where the longer it's been, you kind of forget, and it's like maybe it wasn't that bad, and maybe we may do it again, and it may be that bad.
And a couple of years ago, it seemed like every region of the country in the world was having its own Angular conference in person, and that the momentum of that was obviously halted. So it'll be interesting to see if that comes back. I've seen some hints that the Brebug people will do something like Angular Denver again, but nothing official has been announced. NGRX team has been talking about having a conference, and that's been pushed off for many months. I don't know if it'll happen, but Angular Connect, they never even really announced that it wasn't happening last year, as far as I ever saw. It just didn't.
Yeah, I think Angular Connect, the idea is that like they didn't announce it. Like it happens if it's announced. There's no presumption of happening. Like somebody has to take action to make it happen.
Yeah, but we'll have to see. I mean, are those other ones going to start back up, or are those other ones not going to? Will there be a whole new rush of them? Will there be NG Bolivia, NG Colombia, NG India, all those that I never went to anyway, but looked at longingly? Yeah, I don't know.
That's non-epidemiologist, but I read the numbers in the newspaper like anybody else, and it appears as though U.S. events are likely to start up a lot sooner than a lot of other places in the world. So you mentioned like regional events. Well, regional events that don't require getting through somebody's limitation on flying in and out of somewhere might actually boom, right? There might be a boom in more local events.
Yeah.
If a lot of people have a pent-up demand, but for reasons it's not as easy to travel, maybe we'll see a giant wave of closer local dev events. That'd be super cool. If there's any remotely near here, I'll do them. I'll go.
Yeah.
Cool. Let me see here. I mean, I'm eager to for us to start having some events. We have this beautiful new office space that we've not been able to use much, at least not in terms of like inviting the public into, and I'm really looking forward to meeting the crowds in our space. Let me see here. What else did we have to chat about as small events? Oh yeah, one of you mentioned to me before we started here that kind of following up on some past discussion about how great it is to have a lint tool in the box, that the Ionic tooling now gives you ESLint by default.
Yeah, I was excited to see that even though Angular kind of dropped support for a default linting tool, that all of the different builders of apps around the community have already kind of picked that up as Angular hoped they would, as the Angular team hoped they would, but it's good to see that actually happen.
The part that I'm a little bummed about is one of the nice things about TSLint was Codeliser, and it would give you these Angular specific lintings. And as far as I've been able to find, there's not yet a way to get those back with ESLint. I'd be happy for either of you or for anybody in our chat to say, well, you're totally wrong, Kyle. You've missed the obvious. But that's the thing I'm least pleased with about the whole linting transition is I like kind of tool specific lints to say, hey, you screwed up your selector or whatever.
Well, on my project, we've found that ESLint has been a lot slower for us than TSLint was, just running it on a daily or hourly basis. And maybe it's just a bad setting on our part, but we haven't figured out how to get it. So we're hitting
ESLint
a
is
little bit of a
slower.
pain point on just developer ergonomics.
Yeah, it's slower. I mean, there might be some settings to minimize the slower, but my understanding is that regardless of your settings, it's slower. That's one of the trade-offs of moving to this other lint tool. Is it's just not. I don't know if it's like a thing that can eventually be optimized. So I mean, maybe just a lot of problems you just wait patiently, somebody solves them, right? Yeah, but or it might be a permanent situation. Maybe we have to go to linting once before check-in instead of kind of continuously as we work. Paul, when we teach, do we get much benefit from the live linting?
In teaching, I believe it's actually a slight distraction in teaching. Because we'll be trying to demonstrate a concept or an idea, and lint might be there, bugging us about the thing that we're trying to conceptually speak on. But I remember back in the day when linting in JavaScript land was still fresh and new. We actually did it the way you described, which was like kind of on check-in as part of like a CI/CD environment. That's the only time you got your linting feedback, or you'd have to like manually invoke the tool yourself, as opposed to like kind of getting it as you go in your editor.
I've had the lint tool kind of be a spoiler a few times in teaching, where I bring something up that's intentionally wrong for discussion, and before I can like use that example for the group, the linter is like pointing on the screen. It's like, you spoiled my point, linter. So I guess maybe we won't miss it too much in instruction, but I know that I'll miss it in our production work. I will miss like fast real-time linting in production work once we're fully moved everything over. What else do we have here before our big topic?
I mean, cryptos are always hot and fun to talk about.
Yeah. So I don't know if it's because of this Coinbase. I didn't follow the financial press much, but like there's a Coinbase. It's not quite an IPO, but it's like an IPO-like thing, and that's driven a lot of. Like it's driven my Twitter feed is just absolutely full of a mix between people really excited about Coinbase and crypto stuff, and here we go, this person in chat, just this Dogecoin, and then other people in my Twitter feed that are like, kind of really just very, very relentlessly negative. This is all a terrible thing. It must be stopped. And it seems like there's pretty smart people with both points of view and the whole range in between. This leads me very unclear what to think. I mean, to me, it's kind of it's not yet settled whether this turns out to be a great thing or not. So I'm kind of skeptical of both the people cheering in my Twitter feed and the people that are burn it all down today. What are you seeing out there in the broader community?
Yeah, well, Paul is a lot more into it than I am, so I think my guess is the community that he hangs out with is actually more specifically blockchain focused than mine, because I'm fairly skeptical of it, and it just hasn't been my focus. So I do see some people who get really excited about things, and I see a lot of skepticism, but I'm not really in either community. I just kind of see people talking about it every once in a while. I did see a tweet a little bit ago, and I can't find it quickly, but something along the lines of, if you see someone suggest blockchain as a way to solve a problem, ask, could that problem have been solved with the database? Because if the answer is yes, then they should just use a database. And if the answer is no, then they shouldn't use blockchain, because that's what blockchain is. And I don't know enough about blockchain to know the truth of that, but if that...
Have you seen the flow chart?
Yeah.
There's a flow chart floating around. It's like similar.
Yeah, so it's just an interesting thought, but I can't claim anywhere near the expertise to know where the holes are in that idea.
So I happen to know where the hole is in that idea, and that blockchains are useful for solving distributed consensus problems among parties without trust, possibly not even knowing each other. That's the criteria. So if you say, oh, your problem could be solved with a database, but yeah, of course, we all have to trust whoever operates the database. Then you might actually be looking at a blockchain shaped problem. But if you already all have to if you're already all part of the same organization and have this common point of trust anyway, then yeah, using a database is like 1,000 times easier. But that said, I know that that's like the general rule, but I don't know. I don't know how that applies to specific ideas or projects. Yeah, I guess my Twitter bubble must be pretty broad, because Lance, you said you see kind of more sort of negative commenters, and I see plenty of people across the spectrum of level of excitement about all the blockchain stuff. Yeah, unfortunately, kind of like that is kind of the community in which I would see people opining right now. It is mostly Twitter. Certainly, around my dinner table, we don't talk about such things much.
Well, it's kind of interesting how tech-centric this financial category is. Like the marrying of legal, financial, and technology, and this unique pairing kind of brings technologists to the table in a way that they've not been able to before. And so it's been interesting to see how my social circle and bubble of online presence has now been expanded to include people in a financial sector and in a legal sector that I wouldn't normally have been aware of because of this intersection. I know one of the jokes that I've seen going around is yeah, the developers are coming for the jobs of the lawyers. That idea that you said about that distributed consensus and how blockchain is designed to
definitely
help alleviate the legal issues that surround trust. If that's written into software, then that gives software developers a lot of power at that table.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so my Twitter and Facebook and so on skew a bit toward investors and investees. So I see a lot of people who are company founders going by, a lot of people talking about raising, a lot of people talking about funding. There are days when I'm like, am I the only one I know who doesn't have their own rolling fund? And I know what a rolling fund is, and probably pretty far afield from the topic of our Code Talk Teach. But yeah, there is this huge crossing right now between the developer world and the financial world, and it is very interesting to see where that will go. I find that I think it's a more interesting world, right? Because I think the traditional, maybe until 10 years ago, view of almost every developer is that's a whole other world over there, and maybe a lot of hostility. And now I'm seeing a lot of overlap, and that's that's kind of cool.
And we now live in this world where, hey, here's a public source, openly available, well supported and tested, distributed API for which you can create your own currency. Have fun, developers.
Yeah, something cool might happen. Yeah, that's kind of my point of view. Something cool might happen, and I'm not sure if something cool will happen, but something cool could happen. Okay. Well, I guess we should. It's been 15 minutes. We should probably get on to our promised big topic of the day before either our comment section starts complaining or our view count drops to 0. So our topic is launching a software dev project. We have been involved here at Oasis Digital in launching many projects. We've also we've probably joined more projects midstream than we've been there at the start for. And so, there's a lot of stuff that's maybe out of scope for today, but maybe in another day we'll talk about, the challenges of joining a project midstream. But for today anyway, we should talk about what should one do when launching a project? How do you understanding who the stakeholders are? Orienting how the project fits in, how much do I design before I start coding, that kind of thing. If we start having more than a few words to say, I'll bring up one of those note sheets like I sometimes do for these sessions. I don't know. somebody want to kick off and talk about maybe the first subtopic was like figuring out who are the stakeholders on a project.
I got a thing related to that I think might need to be a prerequisite. That is like who is the subject of this particular conversation? Like what is your role? Not only what you think it is, but what others think it is, and how that actually shapes up. Before you can even talk about the stakeholders, like who is this mythical person that we're kind of centering this conversation around? Is it
you're saying,
a developer? Is it an architect? Is it a product owner? Is it
so one of the challenges of being in this sort of this show type format we're in is that we don't choose our audience and we don't know who our audience is. And so we are, if you were having a one-on-one conversation with somebody, you get to sort of feel them out first and figure out who your exact audience is. That's one of the things I kind of miss about doing this kind of thing in a room. I think that our audience as a company tends to be, we do a lot of training. So a lot of our audience is people entering into the sort of sophisticated enterprise development. But then probably more of our audience are either the kind of most senior developers up through decision makers. The nature of our work is we're often being brought in to help decision makers make something go well, either at the beginning before as it started, or to make it go well if it's not. So I think that from our point of view, talking about launching a software dev project, we could probably have comments that address that kind of that range. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I brought it up not only to kind of drag the question out into the open for the audience, but also like fundamentally, like how you start this thing. It matters a lot and changes a lot as we shift from decision maker down to architect down to senior devs. Like their role in that world, that's going to change quite a bit.
So, stakeholders launching a project. I'll go first. The obvious one is whoever actually needs it.
What do you mean?
Well, if you're launching a project, presumably it's going to create some software that someone needs, right? So I would say that whoever actually needs the working software that's going to come out is your most obvious stakeholder to have in mind as you launch.
Well, and I can see two different angles on that. Because on one side, it will be who's actually going to use it, and the other is who's opening their wallet for it. And those can sometimes be very different people.
Yeah, I'm going to put that. Whoever is paying for it.
Yeah, years ago, I worked on a project, actually for several years. And it was for a very, very large corporation. And the project was being paid for by one department of the corporation in a different city, but we couldn't get any of them to be our actual stakeholders, like on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of this stuff happened before I joined the team. I joined in about 2 years into this 10-year project. But then eventually, so in order to find people who would give us answers on a day-to-day basis, we found some local people who would end up using it. We didn't realize, as the outside consultants coming in, that the people we were ending up talking to had very, very different problems than the people who were giving us money. So after a few years, and unfortunately, for whatever reason, it took a few years to realize this, it came out that what we were building for the people who were talking to us on a daily basis was almost useless for the people who had just spent millions of dollars having us do it. And so then there were a couple of years of trying to completely rewrite the app to satisfy two completely different user bases. So that was a lot of pain. And I wish before I had joined the team that had been clarified, because we could have headed off a lot of trying to figure out how to serve two completely different masters.
Yeah, I put it, I added that to our notes, right? So understanding who's paying for it and what their goals are. Super important to understand who your actual stakeholders are as you launch a project. Who else? I mean, as long as we're throwing easy ones, right?
Well, let's say we're in an organization that is kind of backing this project kind of more I don't know, opaquely. Like it's not clear that there's any one individual who's backing it, and you get more of an organizational backed effort. Like you might be arriving to the party, even though this is a brand new project that's being launched. You might be arriving to the party downstream of someone having decided that, oh yeah, we're going to use, like, of course we're going to do Agile, and we're going to have these, have identified product owners, and we're going to have identified different Scrum leaders and architects, and like you're just the person executing now, like 4 layers deep in the hierarchy. So you might already be subject to that kind of environment.
Yeah, so I'll put those as other important stakeholders to understand. So both the designers and developers are going to be doing the work, and whoever manages them or whoever manages the organization that, as you were saying, might be bringing some decisions might have already been made as a project is launched that are by a couple people removed. So sort of there's a manager of the project, and maybe their manager's peer in the organization has already decided that all projects are deployed with Kubernetes. And so before your project launches, even if we don't know who it's going to serve, et cetera, we have already decided so-and-so. That's great.
I'm going to do that obnoxious thing that I like to do, and I'm going to ask a kind of a leading question back to prerequisite to all this, and that is like, what do you actually mean when you say the word launch?
Yeah, so what I meant when I wrote the words was starting out, the beginning.
Beginning of what?
Yeah, that's a great question, isn't it?
Because I can think of 3 different groups of people, all considering like their involvement to be the point in time in which things actually launch or start.
So I'm going to add. So I need to figure out how to manage space in this notes document. So I'll just start adding stuff, and then when we have to, we will scroll. I hate scrolling on these, but so this topics. This is like stuff that we're adding here after the fact, right? So when is launch? So that's a great question to think about as you're launching in a project, right? So some options are, it could be, right? So it could be when you start designing the features, right? It could be when you start coding, but it could be when you start thinking about what to make, or it could be the decision to proceed. So those
it could
are
be when funding is secured.
That's kind of what I meant, but yeah.
Okay. Could be when the first thing that actually can be run is delivered to someone, depending on their viewpoint.
That's right. That's a great point. I'm trying to figure out how to get my tool is not behaving quite as I would expect. I'm trying to make use of limited space here. So this is an especially great point about the word launch, because in fact, we sometimes have interesting conversations with our own customers in which we're like trying to get in sync on the meaning of the word launch. Because to software developers, sometimes launch means when we started programming. To business people, sometimes launch means when we decided to fund the effort. But to product people, launch almost always means when we initially hand it over to the first users for real use. And so does launch mean start working, or does launch mean initial delivery? Or launch very rarely means after initial delivery, but it sometimes means before the start of coding. I don't want to totally use up our entire time on just divining what launch means, because all the other questions I wrote are all assuming somewhere around the deciding to proceed versus start designing, start coding. So kind of this range that I have highlighting is what I was thinking when I kicked off the question. But yeah, I agree completely. Launch might mean before that, and it might mean after that. This makes me think maybe a topic for a future one of these, Paul, is going to have to interpret the word launch to mean initial deployment to real users, and we probably have a lot to say about managing that process, and a lot can happen there. Any more on that, or should we return to the start of making?
No, I think that's good.
Okay, so are there any other stakeholders to think about?
So related to, because of where we're positioned in the launch, you could have release managers could be considered a stakeholder as you hand off a build artifact to them for packaging and deployment.
Yeah.
Are there any? Is there some more broad? I want to avoid listing every category of technical person in any organization. So would this be like
Marketing, and like deployment, like the people who are responsible for like packaging and delivering.
Yeah,
I was
so let's
thinking
say
DevOps when you said that, not marketing.
Yeah, that'd be
technical and business folks that are sort of outside. So we're whatever we define as the team, right?
Yeah, support. Tech support also as a part of that group.
Well, that would be under technical. So let's see, DevOps. We can list more. If that wasn't clear enough, we'll list more. So what all DevOps, marketing, support. What other categories of folks? And I can just do an etc. until we think of something else. So yeah, so even if you define, okay, here's the team for this project, there are inevitably going to be both managers, but then other people just around an organization who are stakeholders in the success and are involved in some way in that launch. Did I miss any categories?
And I guess like that might seem weird to some folks hearing the idea of the DevOps team as a stakeholder, but for me, I consider anyone a stakeholder who is someone who could show up and disrupt my schedule because something didn't go right.
Well, I mean,
That's
even more directly, like
how I define it.
Like a team, an operations team, DevOps or otherwise, who's going to be responsible for operating a thing, is going to be greatly affected by technical and other decisions made in development. So yeah, definitely stakeholders. So not only could they disrupt you, Paul, you could deeply disrupt them. They might have spent the last year getting revved up to do perfect Windows deployments. And then you show up on release day and say, here's my Linux container. Start running it, please.
Well, I'm experiencing that right now in my project. The company that we're working for has done a lot of software for many years, but they're essentially a C++ Windows shop. And we just released last week that company's first ever web app. And so working with DevOps, they're learning on the fly. And a lot of it is, we're telling them, they're asking us for help. Like, how do we do these basic things? And then we're working together. And they have a parent corporation that has a lot more experience. So they're bringing in other resources. But for the individual people we're working with and their DevOps, this is all a new world.
So they're definitely stakeholders of your effort, whether they wanted to be or not. Yeah. So I guess that brings up an interesting point, though, is that the stakeholders are sometimes people who are actively interested, but it can also include sort of involuntary stakeholders who were happily going along doing their thing and really considered their jobs quite full. And the decisions you make on a project can really, upset their apple cart of involuntary stakeholders. I think we ended up kind of hitting on a lot of the questions about orienting a project in its environment as part of the stakeholder discussion. Is that true?
Well, I'd like to hear what you mean by that line, orienting the project in its environment.
So keep in mind that all I did was think of a half dozen questions or prompts for various aspects of launching a project. But this meant things like, if you're in an organization which has really gotten ahead of the curve and is doing a microservice, micro front-end based enterprise architecture, they currently have 62 services deployed and 7 micro front-ends, and the new project is supposed to launch and then run as part of that environment. And so understanding what other software or hardware, but mostly what other software will this software touch when it's out in the world, that is its environment. And then the other side of it is what humans are going to do things with this software. Now, I think that sometimes, since we work so much in web front end, we sometimes focus maybe a little too exclusively on human users, where we're sort of talk about, well, the software has the user. It's all about the user. It's for the user. There are certainly categories of software development where there is a user, but they're maybe they're so far away that you don't really think of them as the user. There are embedded systems that like no human operates. In our kind of pre-show discussion, we were talking about all this cryptocurrency blockchain stuff, and a lot of that software is not really there are GUIs around that world, but a lot of the software in that world doesn't really get interacted with by a user directly. But it could use it. The environment of the software certainly could include a user. In some sense, it's like an organization, although that starts to get back into the stakeholder list.
Yeah, so I was also thinking of like the deployment environment. Are we even talking about a web project here? Are we talking about like a native project?
I was trying to stay generic.
Okay.
So operating system, deployment, some sort of a DevOps tools, users. Those are at least some of the topics. I need to find a way to get this thing to let me fill my text further. I guess if I was really clever, I would have a more well thought out tool for taking notes here. I think I think I just fixed it. Okay.
So we start a few projects of our own and have been doing so increasingly over the years at Oasis, where we actually design and build our own tools. And we take environment, like we try to make our environment as agnostic as possible for our applications. We try to make it so that we don't have any kind of core dependency on certain pieces of infrastructure being in place. No pre-built servers that exist in the wild, and any connectivity to them must all be configuration driven. And I think that is a side effect and a pushback to what we experience in nearly every client project, where there's exactly one set of servers in the entire organization that can run the servers that we're trying to build against. Yeah. And it's impossible to stand up and run the web project in any world whatsoever other than directly behind their firewall in this one little segment of the organization. When starting off, in the context of starting off a new project, like, any thoughts on how to help folks get to a healthier spot there?
So, kind of tying back to our pre-discussion about how the financial world and the software world seem to be kind of coming together a little bit. I have been on kind of both sides of the table in this world, right? So in our work here, I was working, on behalf of Oasis Digital, where we're, serving our customers to develop software to meet their needs and so on. In a previous company, I was taking my money and using it to hire people to develop software that became a product that we then sold. And I have to tell you, seeing the world from that side, you think it jumps up and smacks you in the face in terms of how you think about some of the decisions you just brought up, Paul. That if all these things are just constraints, well, you just kind of follow along with them and do whatever. But if you find yourself on the other side of the table where you're the one that's going to pay for all these things, then all of a sudden these things don't look like constraints. They look like costs and opportunities to, hey, rather than just saying, well, has someone else decided what the OS is going to be? Has someone else decided how we're going to deploy it? Let's just go do that. If you're producing the dollars to make it happen, then the question becomes, okay, so for the value this project is supposed to produce, what is the most efficient way to produce that value? And I think that we tend to see that most clearly in our work with internal tools, where it's like, well, if there's a server that has to be kept up, kind of regardless of the cost of the server, because servers are pretty cheap. Really, like, it's going to be our time. So if we stand up a server, well, I mean, do you want to be the person that like has to log in and fix it if it breaks? Like, right? So you sort of see that other side of the table point of view. If the answer to like the operations is, I'm going to be operating it. Like if I'm writing software that I'm going to be operating, I have an incredibly powerful incentive to develop that software and to make those environment choices in a way that makes those things disappear. And you mentioned like internal tools. So for example, for the 99.9999999% of the world who's not internal to Oasis Digital, we tend to favor things like Cloud Functions, like Firestore. If we have some files, we don't put them in a file server. We don't put them on AWS S3. If we have some process that has to run on a schedule, we don't like stand up a server and then have somebody, run a monitoring system on it and get paged. No, we set it up to run as a scheduled cloud function where someone who doesn't work here's job is to make sure that scheduler keeps running. So I think there are really big cases where, like, if you care about costs and trade-offs, you kind of need to address those before you start writing any code. So here we are talking about a project launch, and like there are these things jumping up at us, and these are all things that if you think about them before you launch in the sense of writing the first line of code, it could have a really big effect on the cost of operating the solution. What are we seeing at our customers? Of course, we don't name names or anything, but I know that we have customers that have very sophisticated, like Kubernetes-based operation systems, where they can deploy hundreds or thousands of services without really any per-service administration work.
Well, yeah, we literally have everything from clients who use Bazel to organize a monorepo environment to Earl in the accounting department copies a folder and then rename some files and like that. Like we've seen everything.
Yeah.
I think right now, from just kind of thinking back over our client listings, I think the majority of them are doing some sort of microservice infrastructure and some combination of ad hoc monorepo through some subsystem of their development. And everyone's like trying to trend towards the trendy idea of, well, maybe I should just monorepo like Google. To varying degrees of success.
Our customer base on average is very sophisticated and often operating at a considerable scale. But yeah, there's definitely a huge amount of variation in the level of automation and how monorepoed is the monorepo and how continuous is the CI.
Yeah, to me, as the more I've been doing this, the more the conversations in this particular topic, the more important they have become to me, and trying to get clients to think about and care about at the beginning. We've seen Agile and Safe kind of come up as like the recurring theme of how people do development. And unfortunately, we've seen that applied to the discovery of tools and architecture. The idea is that Agile actually isn't supposed to be applied to the discovery of tools and architecture. Like, that is for iterating on features within an application. It's to be applied later in the life of a project. And unfortunately, then the answer to the questions of environment, architecture, tools gets kind of assigned to a mob of people to decide, and usually ends up in the hands of ultimately like a financial decision maker who doesn't necessarily understand the technical ramifications of that decision.
Yeah.
And how that is actually going to hurt their budget, not help it in the long run.
I feel like there's like kind of an obvious rule of thumb around agility, which is that agility is, among other things, about responding to change and creating the ability to keep responding to change in a somewhat efficient manner. And so how agile you should be on a specific decision is roughly a function of like how consequential is that decision and how hard it is to change it. And so, Paul, I think that matches what you were saying pretty closely, that if you just think, well, let's assume there's going to be a server that we hand manage, like that's, depending on the system you're creating, that might turn out to be a very hard decision to change. And sort of taking a, we'll iterate toward the right answer point of view on whether we're going to deploy a server or whether we're going to deploy some cloud functions might not be a very good idea. Or deciding what kind of database are we going to use for this data. I mean, I have seen projects go pretty badly awry because someone just picked out a fun new database of the month to use, and then 3 years later, they're doing this much work to develop a feature where some real thought ahead of time on the data store would have made it this much work to do that feature, because 95% of the work of that feature could have been delegated to the data store. There are people out there reinventing indexing at the application level because the data store they're using doesn't really have an indexing view of the world. And if you really need to be able to index heavily, it is 100 times more expensive to design indexing in your application than it is to have your data store just do it. Lance, I noticed you haven't said much.
One of the things I was thinking about saying a bit ago when you talked about agile is whether it was a big A agile or a little a agile. Agility in terms of actually being agile, or agility in terms of following the agile methodologies as it is described these days. But that's a very different conversation and can take us down a lot of different rabbit holes.
I guess I meant it in a little a sense.
Okay.
Literally, the level at which your decision should be, agile as the word normally means, should be a function of how consequential they are and how hard they are to change, or how hard they are to change later.
Yeah.
And I know it feels like we're spending a disproportionate amount of time on these first couple of points here, but what I've found is that the answer to every question after this keeps being affected by the answers and the things that we discover and understand during these first very two important questions.
I mean, I don't know if I have to index back to like -2 or -3 to get there, Paul, but I feel like the most important aspect of launching a software dev project is making a really wise decision about whether you should launch a software dev project. In that it can be very tempting to say, let's solve this problem in front of us with software development. And, and I say this as having spent a pretty substantial career so far in software development, that not all problems should be solved by let's go write some software.
Yeah, with like the right quantity of duct tape and baling wire, you can actually like cobble together existing systems to solve new categories of problems that come up at like an absolute fraction of the cost of custom software development.
Or
this is a good chance to actually like plug our sister company, XPM. They actually do a great job of using Atlassian products to solve client problems with, and we often will bring them in when we are during the early consulting stages of talking with our clients, when they say things that sound like, hey, this might be a problem best solved by using existing systems. We're not afraid of saying,
right,
have you considered, and looking at how they might be able to do that and save them some money along the way.
And not just money, I guess maybe you argue that the time is money, but often solving a problem by adopting something and tweaking it a bit can take a small fraction of the time. Like even if funds are abundant, if you can solve a problem in 3 months and move on versus solving it in 2 years with a better solution, sometimes the 3-month version is just way better.
Yeah, I mean, there often when you run into a problem, question to ask yourself is, can I really be the first person who has ever had this problem? There has to be some other way that someone has solved this. But
Absolutely.
the project
Great
I'm on
point.
right now, it's very, very specific to a very, very niche bit of manufacturing. It's, there's not going to be off the shelf stuff besides, well, Excel. Excel can do anything. Beyond that,
And I would say
I
that
mean, you joke, but
Am I joking?
most of our, I think most of our customer base here are folks with big scaled, technically sophisticated problems who have a pretty keen sense that they need custom software. But in terms of what I see out there in the world, it's a lot less clear. There are a lot of projects I hear about that I kind of wonder, did that really need to happen? Is that really good? Like, did you need to make a custom mapping system, or could you have just like used Google Maps and put your points on the existing map? That sort of thing. Yeah, Paul, Excel. Excel's pretty great. You can solve so many problems with Excel.
well, it's been interesting to see how many companies out there like run their company off of Excel for 20 to 25 years before finally deciding that, like something has finally come to a breaking point and I finally need some software to solve my problems.
Absolutely. Let's see. Well, we are almost an hour in here, and we still haven't gotten to writing any code. So, are you ready to move on to the next topic that involves maybe not
like
writing
a
any
typical
code?
work day.
Oh, yeah. No joke. So now let's assume that the software development project we're talking about launching is going to be at least to a considerable extent a user interface, or have a user interface or something. So the word design can mean many things, but I'm going to say that what I meant, again, I guess have the privileged position of having me the one that just came up with these half dozen prompts. I kind of meant UX and UI design. And so, I'm not expecting I'm just going to type 3 words that just are the answer to this question, but this seemed like a good prompt of how much of the sort of designing the application, whatever that means and what level of detail, ought happen before it's coded, before you start laying down some code.
Well, in my opinion, I am a big fan of Agile in terms of, agility and the execution of things, but I'm all about some waterfall design of a system. Like, figure out as much as you possibly can, early as you can, both in, how it behaves, what it's supposed to do, and what it's supposed to look like. Because otherwise, you'll have no idea if you even have enough money to finish the thing you're setting up to start.
So you kind of mean not the UI.
Well, yeah, like literally the UI. Like, sit down. Like, what do you want to build? Like, let's talk about the features. Let's talk about what it needs to look like to provide those features. Because this is going to decide, whether or not you can even come within an order of magnitude of your budget. It will make those things cheaper, but it will also at least start to give you the sense of whether or not it's even possible.
So, I'll admit I have a few times, maybe more. I've gotten a little crosswise a couple times, even with customers, which not a good thing to do, but I'll admit it's happened a few times. If you're a customer watching this, I probably won't be the tech lead on your project, so you can be angry at me for this. Sometimes somebody has to bring the hard truth that, hey, if we can't even afford the time to have a discussion and write down what the software is going to do, we need to be realistic that that's 100 times or 1,000 times or more less work than actually building it. We should probably just not do it. If we can't spare the time, like you're saying, Paul, to like design and iterate. I'm not saying like pixel level design. I'm saying decide what screens are going to exist and what the functionality is going to be and what's going to happen. Like what fundamentally, not like lines of SQL, but what the system is going to do as it's operated. If you can't do that, there's no way you're going to get through building it.
Yeah, I've found that and the reason why I put this in the UX UI design category is that I found more and more often that the only time to get the answers to what should the system do is when you're arguing over the placement of 4 or 5 pixels.
It is amazing how often a discussion about pixels ends up turning into a discussion about what are we actually building. Absolutely.
So I kind of default to a position of let's talk about pixels now as a Jedi mind trick to tricking you into telling me what the system should do.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's really good. I wish everybody did that. Huh.
And then of course we get to break the news to them that, oh, well, that pixel perfect design you wanted is probably going to cost you more.
Yeah, so I don't know if it fits in right here. I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, but I have this rule of thumb that the first thing you should do on a project as you launch it is do a speed run through having all the screens and all the buttons do something that's at least somewhat toward what the functionality is going to be before you invest your first dollar in how they look. I mean, I'll put my name next to this in case no one else wants to sign off on it. But I sometimes call that functionality first, in that have the discussion about what screens are going to be there, because that can prompt the discussion about what the system's going to do. But then as you, like, if you got to decide how are we going to spend the first 3 weeks on this project, I would typically spend as much of those as possible just making the screens exist and making them have the right controls and making at least some of them do the right thing, rather than spending the first 3 weeks. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, even if it looks ugly, it can start delivering value.
Well, and even if it doesn't reach a point that any real user could use it, like even if it fails to deliver value, I feel like we'll learn so much. The amount of learning from just like lacing these screens together. If you discover that, like, yeah, the thing that we thought we talked through in the design process, it actually doesn't work because the information we need here isn't actually present until someone enters it 3 screens later, right? You can like discover fundamental logic bugs in the design on your first speed run through the implementation, when it's very cheap still, because you're only a few weeks into a project. It's still pretty cheap to go back and like say, hey, you know what, our design was wrong.
Yeah.
We have a commenter here. Okay.
Yeah, even in the case, so not even just like screen flow getting out of sync, but like you might actually go about discovering that there's some fundamental property of physics that makes it not possible to create the thing that you're wanting to create. And I don't have to spend.
To our fine customers who are sometimes, in certain cases, operating at the edge of what physics allows. But go ahead.
Yeah, Stadia.
Where I thought you were going to go with this is not quite where you went, but the concept of a tracer bullet, of making sure that you can do a connection from the very front end all the way to the back end. And then make sure that works. And I had a project once where this was 30 years ago, and so things weren't going as well as they were. But like we realized way too long that we were trying to send megs, hundreds of megs down, and so it just wasn't going to work. I guess you did have tracer bullet there. I just missed your typing.
I just typed it as you said it. So
okay.
You full credit.
Okay.
But I realized that I had this what parts to code first, and that my thing I'd written up here actually goes down there.
But it's a different idea, and I don't know which one is better. Like, so the tracer bullet is a depth first. Make sure you can go front to end and go all the way through and have your communication. But what you were showing was more of a let's make sure that the flow makes sense from the user perspective, and those are 2 very different concepts. Both of them are valuable. I'm not going to say which one I think is better.
Yeah. No, actually, there's these. So one candidate of things to code first is the overall screen flow. Very rough appearance, and here we're gonna validate the data flow of the overall system, and then the other is the kind of functionality tracer bullets that are basically sort of validate, and this is like validating basically that the architecture works. Is that Is that the right axis? Am I thinking about this right?
Yeah, kind of. The architecture works that all of the tiers work if it's a
Yeah.
multi-tiered
Yeah,
application.
tiers.
Yeah.
Well, and that's why I prefaced what I said about like the waterfall design with the agile execution. Like I would describe these two aspects of being agile on the execution of the thing once you have a design, overall design in place.
So my very hot take, I guess, is that I don't think it pays off to be particularly agile in the first few weeks or first couple months even of a project. In that, if like let's say we're trying to get the overall screen flow in place because we want to validate that like the fundamental what data has to be where will work, and we want to get those functionality tracer bullets in place because we want to validate that the architecture will work. Like fundamental to agile is responding to feedback. But to me, in some projects, not all, it really pays off to like respond to feedback by thanking the person and then just like putting it on a list to not look at for a few more weeks. Because I think there's generally greater value in a project of getting the rough version, by either axis that we talked about here, through before really paying any attention to feedback about the details of some of the screens and so on along the way. I have seen projects go kind of awry in that we thought the project was going to take 9 months, but 8 months in, we're still working on the first 3 of 7 screens because we've been doing a great job responding to feedback every single week and iterating on those. The problem is we haven't yet learned that our basic system is not going to work because we haven't wired it up all the way to the endpoint yet.
Yeah. Now, I've managed to go a full hour without saying the words Angular for Architects, but
I'm going to step away for 2 minutes while you do a commercial for Angular for Architects.
Well, this stuff is now deep into the heart of what we talk about in that class, and one of the characteristics of the class is that we actually have like a little marker in a timeline of creating a project from scratch and then going through to deployment. We talk about that timeline, and there's a marker that is about halfway through that timeline that says this is the spot where big A Agile should be applied to the project. And one of the things that we haven't actually hit that spot yet in the timeline of what we've got developed here, but one of the things that we talk about are things that I call cross-cutting feature concerns. And it's the idea of what does our authentication and authorization look like? Like, how do we make it so that all the stuff that we do across all the features is using that proper authentication and authorization? And if we were being agile and responding to feedback, like we would never actually get our stuff all the way secured, and we'd have every single team that's doing something a little bit different would have 5 different approaches for how to deal with authentication and authorization. When what really needs to happen is like one of the architects needs to be left alone to go figure it out, put it in place, create some standards from which the rest of the team can then utilize. And of course, then it can be iterated on, but it's being iterated on and it's being developed in a way where that architecture for that aspect is centralized and everyone benefits from the changes and the iteration, rather than it be now we've got to go track down the 17 different ways that people have now done auth Z and update all of them to catch this new case that we're dealing with. And so that idea of cross-cutting concerns, definitely we've skipped ahead to this what parts to code first, but that is another category of things to code first that I feel should take place prior to the agile, the big A agile iteration cycle.
And sometimes, depending upon the place that you're working, sometimes you'll be the first people working on these things and everything will be an adventure. Sometimes they will have the way to do authentication and it will be well documented, and sometimes it will be anywhere in between.
I think that's what I had in mind with the environment subtopic up here more. That idea that if there's a really great, well-established, highly functional organizational answer to authentication, then it's like incredibly unhelpful to reinvent that per project, right? Like literally no user wakes up thinking, I love using my single sign-on for all the other apps, but I want to have a different way to sign on to this new one being built, right? That's kind of contrary to the nature of people, and it would violate the single and single sign-on.
There's a comment from someone on YouTube. I just want to address it that way it isn't forgotten, and hopefully we can get into more depth later on. So I just want to give you a little one-line response.
Tell me which one it is, Paul, and I'll bring it up.
Daniel is saying, I'm hoping NX Workspace makes project planning more efficient.
Yeah, this topic right here.
Yep, and I just one-liner response. Hopefully we can get into it more later. But I would say if you're learning it on your own and you're not getting help from someone who already knows NX deeply, then I would say your second project will have much more efficient planning. On the first project, you're going to make a mess of it and learn. But yeah, it does work really well once you've gotten the hang of it. So that's all I wanted to say for now. Hopefully we get time to come back to it more in depth later. I also wanted to go back to the UI UX, talk about another axis there, and that is. Let me
bring this back up onto the screen here. Yeah. Okay. So on this question of how much of that do we do before we start? Yeah.
There's a whole category of style of work here where your team may be, unfortunately, in the world of not only are you going to be building this app, but for whatever reason, we've found a large influx of teams where the team is also responsible for setting the UI standard for the organization. And so not only are they designing their app, but they're also designing the third party or the organization's component library that happens to go out for everyone to use within that framework. Yeah, so that's another good category there. Future developers who use it as an example of a library.
So yeah, you might be building a thing that's going to be consumed by other developers in their work, and so even though their identity is unknown, these unknown future people are really possibly the most important stakeholders on some projects, right? You just described maybe your what was your example more specifically?
Well, you have an organization where you're creating the component library, visual component library for your org for Angular, React, whatever. And so in that case, there's a prerequisite of UX UI design. In an ideal case, you would have the component library UI UX designs completed and even have the implementation done before you go start on your project. Never happens that way, but that'd be ideal.
Yeah. I think it's very this is a popular kind of project, but I think it's very challenging to really deliver value creating a component library for things that don't exist yet. Because when those things happen, they have this way of needing components different from the ones that were developed for the library. And this has been really quite challenging across many projects. And I don't just mean many Angular projects. It's our most popular technology today for anybody watching. The thing that we use most is Angular. But predating before Angular existed, we've worked on those here have worked on projects where in many ways, the features of a component library end up defining what project can be built, right? It's well, if here's our toolkit, we're going to use this to make screens. If this doesn't have a date range picker, making a date range picker is super hard. If this has a poor data grid, then an application designer might build a different user experience, a different screen flow, a different feature set based on what components are available in a component set. So that, really big. In fact, that I made a mistake here, Paul. It's not just future developers who might make use of it. it's really like this
future
is like
stakeholders.
Yeah, we have recursion. Maybe we should have a rule that once recursion occurs, that's when the show is over and we punt to the next one. Yes, we've hit recursion. For some projects, the stakeholders of this project are the stakeholders of future projects that will depend on this project. And so, yeah.
Now, I have heard both arguments for the UI UX specific case that you were talking about. How if you do it all beforehand, then you don't have what you need for your app. On the flip side, I have seen people build their apps in parallel to the building and designing of the UI component kit, and then those apps never actually get up to speed of using the UI component kit, or if they do, it's at a huge cost to the client. They effectively end up writing the app twice.
So I want to shout out Nick here and also Daniel and thank them for their comments and tell them, I guess we're obligated on YouTube. Make sure you like and subscribe. And make sure you tell all of your friends. We recently passed 100 subscribers as we record this. We'd like to have at least like 1,000 or something. So be great. Help us get more. We appreciate it a lot. Yeah, Paul, that's a great point. There are those who just sort of kind of intentionally punt on this a bit, right?
Yeah, we've had a lot of business in the last year of Angular clientele who have come to us and said, we have a component kit, we have an Angular app. Neither of them are what we want, and we need to get them both put together. And we have the unfortunate job of being the one to tell them, well, this is going to hurt. It's not going to be pretty. The reason why you're having a hard time is because you're doing it the hardest way possible now.
I hate to get too terribly Angular centric on a generally mostly technology neutral episode, but here's an example of that calls out to me, Paul. Is I think you discovered this one, so I'm parroting what you told me, that there's two different ways of building custom controls. One where you embed the native control, and the other where you wrap the native control. And that ends up having really major consequences on what people can do downstream. Now you've been
So you're talking about like a custom input field.
Yeah.
Where one of them exposes the actual input element.
Yeah.
And the other one is actually internal to the component.
Yeah, okay. Could you maybe run with that as an example of what you're saying, of like decisions made in a previous iteration of a component set can put you in a very difficult, expensive position on a current project?
Yeah. You might have it such that the folks who originally designed the first iteration of the component library, they did so where the input is hidden behind a my-org input box. And the actual input element isn't exposed. They just expect you to pass in bindings and bind event bindings to it and interact with it that way. The idea and the hope was that this would create a component that was nice and encapsulated, easy to use, and consistent across everyone. No matter what you did, you always got that same look and feel. And I'm going to further pass the credit along. I actually heard about these ideas. I had run into them, but then seeing them formally expressed from the Angular material team and their experience of authoring the Angular material component set, they went through the process of realizing that when you do that, what happens is you hide the native elements that many of the browser technology tools need developers to have access to do their jobs. The most common of these, like ARIA tags, the ability to enhance and add the proper accessibility, things like the need for internationalization and localization, being able to properly work on those ARIA tags for more complex components, just being able to do their job at all. The alternative is that you would have a my-company-input box that it would transclude, or it would do content projection of an input element that went inside of that tag as you added it to the page, as opposed to living inside the definition. And that little bitty difference, that one little difference will completely change how you end up writing a lot of your applications, because you end up doing like form control bindings in a much more native way. It gives you access and the ability to do that. If your custom input didn't have that before, now you suddenly have access to use that again and should be using that again. It's going to completely change the data architecture of your application because you can now use forms again. And so that might, like, the impact that that has and how much that spirals is always surprising to folks when they see this actually play out in practice.
I think this is maybe not appreciated as much by folks who have only ever used one of the non-Angular libraries for building this sort of single-page app. That Angular's form system, although it has this widely discussed issue of it's not strongly typed enough, it's really a wonder. It is really a very powerful, highly leverageable thing. And I guess those of you in the other worlds of front-end dev, you have some cool stuff, but we have some cool stuff in Angular also. Generally, you have to reach outside of your core tool to find good form support, and so it's not sort of it doesn't become a common language across all your components in, say, React as it does in Angular. Paul, since you mentioned Angular Material, broke the seal on that, I'm going to put a question here in our notes. Let me get these shared back up here. And that is, specifically, should you pick a design system before you start coding? Or like, at what point do you need a design system? I mean, I think the bare minimum I would say is you should pick your design system before you start any visual polish. I can imagine like making a rough, unstyled app before you narrow down your design system. So at what point have you been encouraging people to pick their design system? Let me ask it that way.
As early as possible. As early as it can possibly be done. I actually gave an entire talk on the ramifications of not doing so. One of the things that you'll find is even in the world of like, yeah, I got this thing functionally working, it's not the greatest, and now I'm going to go back and I'm going to apply a design system to it, is there are huge like functional mismatches between what certain design sets are capable of. So for example, a date range picker or a date time picker, combo picker, one that lets you pick the date and the time. Simply the presence or absence of these can be a make or break deal as to whether or not you can actually port your functionality from one design system to another. Obviously you can kind of cobble together and recreate them, but that's what you end up doing. You end up needing to add another layer of custom control work if you end up building something that like there's a functional mismatch for your applications. The analogy I gave was it would be like there's a reason why we decided database near the beginning of a project, because our features help dictate the kind of database technology and storage we should be looking for. Like, do we have relational data models? Do we have mostly standalone data models? Is a JSON representation that we just serialize, is that sufficient? Are we going to be doing a lot of querying, a lot of joining? Are we going to be, what kind of environment does that database live in? We actually put all this thought into this choice of our database and decide the database fairly early. We should be asking the same questions of the visual features of our application. Like, what kind of tasks is it going to be doing? Are there a lot of forms? Are there a lot of date controls? Are there a lot of date-time sensitive combinational controls? Are there a lot of grids? Like, all of these kinds of questions should go into forming our selection of a design system. And if we don't consider those early, then we end up with having to go back and do a lot of papering over, just like if you'd picked, a JSON data store whenever you're doing a lot of joining. Now in your app, you're doing a lot of papering over that mismatch in order to make your app functional. It's the same thing, has the same risks in terms of delivery at the end of the day too.
So I wrote this as you should probably decide the design system before you do your design, because I think there are folks who want to see a design system as like a layer of pretty sparkles that you can just go back and sprinkle over your application. But the folks building design systems often see them as being quite opinionated on like what pieces exist to be put together. And so the design system is probably going to inform not only what your input controls look like, but like how navigation works in your system.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the system I'm most familiar with is Angular Material, and Material is definitely opinionated about where tabs should be and shouldn't be, and when you should have button bars, and when you can have multiple different types of buttons. It's that doesn't mean you have to follow the suggestions, but if you're actually going to follow that design system, there's a lot more there than just choosing the component set.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of bringing together a design system and a UX designer, specifically UX. The distinction is important, and bringing those two things together and asking the UX designer to do their best to be constrained by the design elements of the design system in question, because that's going to put you on a fast track to building it right the first way cheaply.
So I always like to point out when that comes up that our scope of how we help people at Oasis Digital has actually expanded over the last few years to where we help folks with the UI UX layer for these exact reasons, that we've been seeing customers of ours impacted negatively in terms of cost and schedule by not really using the design system like in the most fulsome way, but as more of like, can I sprinkle over some appearance? And we're trying to fight back against those costs to help our customers get more sooner, better, cheaper, by doing exactly as you said, like get involved at the design layer to like work in a way aligned to the design system you've chosen to avoid the kind of problems to come up. I'm going to drop a link in here, by the way.
Yep.
So I think if I drop this link, I believe it will end up in the kind of in the chat afterward. But this is a talk that Paul gave that hits on many of these issues in great depth. I think he titled it like the dangerous something of customizing Angular material. That's just, I think, a clickbaity title. There's a lot of just great discussion in there about making good decisions in how to design and implement a system.
Yeah. Great comment coming in from YouTube, from Michael Lang. Kyle, if you wouldn't mind getting those on the screen for us, I want to talk to those.
His what? I can only put one at a time.
Well, the one where it starts with planning is one thing. Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with this, and I'm not at all trying to say like, oh, everything should be planned up front. Like when it comes down to it, like I'm describing like idealized worlds where if you can do all of these things up front, that's great. I think the execution of all of this should still have a healthy dose of skepticism sprinkled in, and so that the implementation is such that you have your strong decoupling and your strong separation of concerns that allows you to make the necessary pivots as changes come up. And so when it comes time to actually like write some code, definitely plan on doing that in a way that you assume the rug's going to get pulled out from under you at any point in time.
Let me bring up his second comment here.
Yeah, and then like worst case scenario, you're dealing with someone who actually goes out, and we actually had a client that had a design system, built out the design system. We helped them finish up an app, and we were deep in the machinery of an agile execution environment where we did not have access to an end user, and we were joining very late in the game. They were nearing completion before they even brought us in, and they informed us that, oh, we just put the app in front of their client, so they were building this out for someone, and the someone that they were putting it in front of absolutely hated the design. So they did all of these things right.
Yeah.
Got to the finish line, with the exception of early collaboration with the actual, stakeholders, the actual buyers of the software, the users of the software. Had they done that early, of course, this would all have been averted. But yeah, they did all of that right just to find out with, I think it was like 2 months to go, that they hated everything about the visual style that was picked.
So I think that if you, I don't think anyone here was saying don't be agile, just figure it all out and do it perfectly the first time. But I think if you kind of follow what we were talking about earlier, maybe bring these notes back up, where you get an application like working, not actually working, but just like roughly the right controls on the right screens with links between them. You pick out a design system, you use those design system components, you do all the easy ones on your early initial pass. You'd have something that you could show to people quite early in a project relative to all the work to make all the buttons actually work and all the fields actually be populated with the right data. You could have something quite early, maybe a third of the way into the project or less, to be able to get that kind of feedback you're talking about, Paul, where like maybe someone who sounded like they'd be okay with something at the beginning, once they just see some screens, let them have that big negative reaction toward, somewhat nearer to the beginning of the project than the end, at least, where if you have to do a major pivot to have a happy customer, you don't discover that, like you were talking about, most of the way to the finish line.
Right.
I saw the word estimate come up in there, so I'm going to bring up a link here. So this is a deep cut. This is a blog post of mine. Sorry to reference myself too much. From 11 years ago.
Wow.
And when I wrote the blog post, at the time, I remember it being something I had thought at least a decade before that. And I won't bore anyone by reading the whole blog post now. But the essence is that our use of language is terrible in terms of having a common agreed meaning when we talk to each other, between developers, between each other, between developers and other stakeholders, in that we often will say the word estimate when what we mean is a promise, a commitment, a quotation, or so on. And in fact, it's not just our fault. People out in the service trades have trained people in their daily life to use the word estimate to mean a quoted fixed cost for a good or service. And so my suggestion, which I didn't come up with what the answer would be, but I think we may need to consider the word estimate so deeply tainted by that meaning, by that alternate meaning of the word estimate, in which it means a fixed price and time quote, that we should maybe stop using the word estimate in software development and try to find a different word to mean I am trying to make a projection, a calculation of a probability distribution of what might happen based on everything we know now, versus I am coming up with a plan and a backup plan by which we can commit to delivering X for date and cost Y and Z. Because those things are so radically different that when those meanings are crossed, really no helpful communication can happen. If I'm saying my estimate is 4 months and the person is hearing it as Kyle is committing to delivering in 4 months, I have been able to mostly avoid that misunderstanding by trying to always draw a probability distribution chart when discussing estimates. But that's only helpful for the sort of people who like thinking in terms of probability distributions, right? There are folks out there where that doesn't help them.
Yeah, that's That's interesting. I had not thought about that, about estimate meaning something different in our community. It does remind me, a few days ago, there was a tweet that went semi-viral of what's a word that has drastically different meaning in your field from the meaning in the general public.
Okay.
And I responded to it. I had 5 suggestions. One was promise. And I was thinking about, software, like the asynchronous thing, completely different than the word promise in your blog post there. But other ones that I had were string, thread, PR, and of course, banana in a box.
I love it. Well, it seems like we need to throw estimate onto your list.
Yep. I didn't think of that, but that's a good point.
So sorry for that deep diversion into the meaning of the word estimate. But it probably is relevant to a viewer, Michael, to what they were thinking in their situation.
And another diversion, you may have noticed me looking aside. I'm going to see if this works at all with this
it's
camera.
snowing.
Yeah, this is April 20th in St. Louis.
Yeah.
This is not normal.
Yeah, I'm looking. My camera is much harder to move than yours, but I'm not used to this.
Anyway.
So our audience, which of our 100 subscribers, surely at least one is a car nerd statistically. So I already put my summer tires on, man. I can't even drive in this. I'm not going anywhere. I have to get out a different car if I want to leave the house. Okay. Okay, so we should probably end our diversion from the estimate promise problem. So we have a few more promised topics, and we're getting pretty deep into our allotted time. I wanted to know everyone's thoughts on this. So let's say you have done some sort of reasonable planning process. Let's say you're pretty good at estimating, right? Maybe you've done a lot of projects before. You got some well-qualified, smart folks, do a good job. They have correctly calculated that this project's going to take about a year. It's going to take about 9 people. Just assume, for the sake of argument, in some scenario that's correct. What are our thoughts in terms of how big of a team starts writing code on day one? Like, if you think you're going to need 9 people, should you start with 9 people? Should you start with 1 person and add one every 7.5 days? Like, what based on our experiences, what range of things typically makes sense in terms of how fast to grow a team from kickoff to final size?
For 3 months or fewer in terms of work, 2 people, full time.
So if it's a large project,
even for a large project, it's going to take more than 3 months.
You're saying like the first few months should start with a couple of people.
Yep.
I
don't care how big it is. I don't care. What scale?
How fast can you grow? Or actually, I should ask the question. So, in fact, I want to ask the question a little bit differently. If we want to, for minimum waste, we should start with 2, and then how fast can we add people, on average, if we care about minimizing waste? Like add 1 every few weeks thereafter?
Well, I think so. Let me. I don't know how to answer that without explaining my first part of the answer.
Yeah.
So the 2 people for 3 months.
Yeah.
That comes back to an idea that I talk about kind of quite often in Angular for Architect, which is an idea called surface area.
Yeah.
Like, in order to effectively make changes and not be stepping on one another's toes within a Git graph, with constantly creating merge conflicts, you have to have enough surface area in your project. And you can have about 2 people in there working together, figuring out and organizing amongst themselves which cross-cutting concerns that they want to work on and put in place and set the standards for. And it'll take, give or take 3 months for them to go and actually do all that. To put the auth-auth in place, to put logging solutions in place, to put
Yeah.
Any schematics of particular importance up front in place, to get the build process in place, to get CI/CD working to at least a minimal version. Like there's all of these things that are deeply entrenched that will touch and modify the entire code base up front. That any attempt to do feature development while that is going on is just going to lead to a train wreck of merge conflicts.
So I would describe that as my third bullet point, that a project may hit a kind of inflection point when enough of the common stuff has been laid down that it can then sort of splinter off into different subsystems, which can then have enough surface area that development work is not stepping on other development work very much, and then you can scale up a lot more. Does that match what you were thinking?
Yeah, because keep in mind, like the other overhead is not just merge conflicts. It is how fast can you review PRs effectively, and how efficient your CI/CD pipeline is. If you're going full CI/CD and every one of these merges needs to pass some end-to-end testing, if you've got a bunch of people trying to push to that and you've not yet successfully scaled your CI/CD, you're going to have a fixed number of times where you can even possibly try and get commits into the main line.
So I don't think we have published it yet, but I'm going to drop another link here on the screen. So those who are interested in what Paul just said, make sure you subscribe to Oasis Digital's main YouTube channel, because over there in the next few days, a talk that I gave on Bazel will come up and be published. And it digs into what you just said, Paul. Sometimes there are like these really severe limits on just how fast is it possible to get code CI/CD'd and merged. And that can form a hard limit, like a physics limit on how fast you can go on your development. And we help people with that using Bazel.
So I'm hearing a potential conflict in what Paul just said with what we said earlier. Because what I'm hearing from Paul is start out first with a couple people working on the cross-cutting concerns that aren't really specific to the app. But earlier we said start out with having features, looking at the features within the app so that you can see the different screens, or do a tracer bullet to the back end, which seems to be very specific to the app. So is there a tension there, or am I just misunderstanding something?
I mean, we're trying to be super vague here because we're trying to say things that apply broadly to many kinds of projects. But yeah, I would say there are projects where you might initially set aside certain cross-cutting concerns to like get some feature surface area laid out to validate you're building the right thing. But then you might have to sort of stop for a while and do what Paul said and say, okay, now that we have about the right thing laid out, we really have to figure out permission control before it's practical to go implement all these other systems. So I think both things could be true.
Yeah, I would say for me, my definition of a tracer bullet, like your tracer bullet is actually worthless unless it's passing through all the cross-cutting concerns.
Yeah. You might make day one version of the screen might be anybody can come in and click the button, and then the space shuttle launches. But the tracer bullet isn't done until it's like checking you had permission to launch the space shuttle correctly, right?
Yeah, and that's really what I'm talking about is adding those cross-cutting concerns. Like it sounds like a big deal if you're thinking about this from the perspective of I've got a big app with lots and lots of features, and I'm going to go lay these cross-cutting concerns down across all of them. But at project start, you don't have that. You have one feature, and that is your tracer bullet. So you're in essence adding the cross-cutting concerns to your tracer bullet feature to prove that you've in fact got the practice and pattern established.
Yeah.
And so it's not this large sprawling thing that you're doing. It is, can I auth Z one request? Can I properly add logging in the case of a failure? Can I handle do I in fact have a pattern established for route guarding, things like that.
So Paul, in this scenario where maybe you start with, let's say two people start, and then they quickly just make some screens that have some controls on them to validate the designed workflow, and then they start digging into the cross-cutting stuff to make some of those things do the right permission checks in this example, right? So how soon, typically speaking, every project is different. How soon and how fast would you grow if you don't want to just have people sitting around waiting for the first 2 people to get the permission system right? Just on average.
If we need more people, like this is something I've had to do a bunch is, like if there's an insistence that I have 6 people for you to use and you need to start putting them to work on day 1, like what I will do is I'll literally take those 2 groups or those 6 people and split them up into 2 groups of 3 and have them mob their things that don't conflict with one another. And on the surface, this sounds like waste, but in reality, what you're doing is you're building up 6 people that know the infrastructure of the app and who will turn around and become PR reviewers whenever it comes time to add more people to the project. You're actually going to develop that knowledge needed for them to be effective without creating conflict. And so you're actually going to end up accelerating your team's growth by mobbing this stuff.
So the reason I mentioned the idea of minimum waste versus minimum elapsed time is that if there are just extra people available, right? Let's say that the company has already budgeted to have 10 developers on the project. They've already assigned them to the project. They're just sitting there, and so there's no minimizing waste by having those people not join the team now. If we're trying to minimize the elapsed time, you'd say you could maybe start with 5 to 10. How many people could start?
I mean, I think you could get 3 people working effectively. So, I had 3 people, 3 to 4 people, 9 to 12. You can have 9 to 12 getting things done, but it won't look like everyone making commits.
Right. So this is the idea. If you're gonna do that, you need to do just massive mob programming. I think that's what I heard you say.
Yeah.
You don't have 12 people each creating merge conflicts. You break into groups and then work together. And I would say we're kind of giving away our company's secret by pointing this out on our video podcast, but this just pays off amazingly. We've had tremendous success early in a project before the shape is really all that laid out, by just get together and work on the thing together for a few hours every day, day after day. I think some of our greatest successes have come when we did that.
Both for the client and for the company.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, by successes, I mean we made things that did what our customers needed. Great.
We found that creates your highest polish, your highest reusable code.
Yeah.
You catch things like accessibility. You catch things like technical memory leaks. Like all the little gotchas, when you get all those people attacking it together, you solve all the gotchas in one shot.
You get deep, shared, common understanding of what you're trying to do and how you're trying to do it. And that just pays off so well.
And everyone is learning what the other person knows while doing it. So you're developing just better, not just the product knowledge share, but like technical execution knowledge share. Even silly little things like, hey, there's this really cool keyboard shortcut I learned yesterday. And now everyone just shaved 20 seconds off of their development time in an hour session.
That's why I look for every chance to code with you, Paul, because I learn a new amazing keyboard trick every single time that I never even heard of before.
Yeah, sounds silly, but all those things really add up.
So I want to throw out my crazy idea on this axis, and that is, it's a crazy thing, but I've done this before, and it was with my own money, so I wasn't wasting anybody else's money with this. And I've had this pay off greatly, and that is sometimes it pays off to hire more than one person or more than one team to independently attack a problem, not to collaborate, to compete, and then periodically down select to the one that's working better. And that to do that, you have to, instead of having a rigorous planning view of the world, you have to have more of an investor view of the world. So tying back to that coming together of development world and finance world, right? So if you think of the world in terms of like placing bets or making investments, maybe you like place your initial bet by having, you get 8 people and you have them in groups of 2 go work on some problem independently. And then after a couple weeks, you look at it and you down select to just the 2 of them that were getting the furthest, that had the best results. And then you redivvy the people onto those. Or maybe you discover that some of the people should be assigned to another project entirely. And then you wait another few weeks, and maybe you down select further to one solution. When you really, really, really need something to happen fast, sometimes placing multiple concurrent bets can pay off. You have to have a very different view of the world than you're likely to get from like kind of a traditional project management way of thinking to do this. You have to have a betting or investing view of the world. But I've had that really pay off.
Yeah, I would like to add another point, and that is like this whole thing is this whole section that we're talking about right now has a big caveat of like we're talking about vertical development teams here. Like assuming a vertical development team that works on back end, front end, full stack, or has members on the team that can make a full stack effort.
Yeah.
If you start talking about back to microservices, micro front ends, you kind of have given up before you've started in terms of minimal waste on collaboration. You already have established the team size by way of the microservice distribution of what you're trying to do, and that is very difficult to work effectively in. And probably one of the biggest challenges of that is not the technical execution, but the collaboration and the coordination of that effort.
Yeah, I mean, we sometimes take on entire projects, but we sometimes just sort of land in projects to help customer teams with problems they're having. But, we're not there to solve all their problems. We're there to solve the problems that we were brought in to solve. And so sometimes we see some really interesting, not exactly failure modes, but inefficiencies. And I think that's a big one you're talking about, Paul, is when you have concurrent teams, but they're working on different tiers of a system, like the collaboration between them and lining up can just waste schedule to a tremendous degree. And it's tough because sometimes you have like different languages, platforms, different expertise that makes it really hard to create that kind of vertical, idealized vertical development team you're talking about. And so, I see how very sharp people end up with the kind of the tiered model of organizing teams, but I've also just seen it end up so expensive. Do you have any advice for teams that are for whatever reason stuck in that situation where there's like the server developers in that building and the client developers in this building?
Spend your money on a proof of concept outside of your company's best practices.
Interesting.
If it works, then spend the money to do it right within your organization constructs.
That kind of reminds me in a completely different world. Back in college, I was a parliamentarian for a student group. This will
I love this story.
I promise. And so 1 year I was a parliamentarian for a student group, and then the next year I was not. I was an RA, but they were trying to rewrite the constitution of that student group, and like their meetings are the same day of the week as the RA meetings, but they actually they had one last meeting where they could try to finish rewriting the Constitution, and it was at the same time as my thing. And so they begged the head of the RA program to let me come back just to be in there. And I had a tool in my toolbox that the normal parliamentarian didn't know about, because they were stuck here, just getting trapped in Robert's Rules of Order. But then I said, all right, I'm going to tell you about something. I will solicit someone to move as if in committee of the whole. And what that means is we will pretend like we're not actually doing Robert's rules, and you'll just let me run the meeting as efficiently as I want. And then when we're done, I'll move to leave the committee. And then as the whole group, you can vote on whether to accept what the committee voted on. And they're like, okay. And so as soon as they moved that, I was just like, okay, let's get this done. And I just dropped all the Roberts rules and I just did quick, and just ran through it and got in about 45 minutes, did what would have taken several weeks worth of meetings. And then at the end, I'm like, by the way, we're still in this committee. Anyone want to leave it? Yeah, I move that. Okay, we're done. And everyone want to accept it? Good. And they're just amazed because I was able to come in and say, you don't have to do things the hard way. You need to get something done. Relax your rules just for a little bit within these constraints, and then you can accept it. So it's kind of analogous to what Paul was just saying, I think.
Yeah, Lance, I think so. The reason why I love this story is that I think that every development process, agile or otherwise, and every team needs their version of the tool you're describing.
Yeah.
Because it can save so much cost and schedule if you can intelligently know when not to do what you normally do.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was just a matter exactly of knowing right now, we don't need all those rules. We need the solutions. I'm not, and they trusted me enough that I wasn't going to wreck things. There were not trolls within the group who were just going to take advantage of the freedom. But I also like as far as they knew, I had the ability to kick the trolls out. So if there had been any, it was a nice moment and it worked. But it would not.
That word trust for the fellow consultants that might watch this video, you can't do this trick until you've got a well-established trust with your client.
Yeah.
You're not going to come into a project and say, yeah, hey, I'm just going to go ahead and ignore all your rules and do it my way. You've got to prove your worth. You've got to build the trust. You've got to show them that you are there to help them, that you're not just, swooping in, trying to do a thing and running off. You've got to work. You've got to put in the trust. And then once you have it, you get that leverage to do such a thing.
Yeah, that reminds me of something that another friend of mine says about artists, that people who are learning art will complain, why do I have to do it this way? Art needs to be free. But then it's actually a matter of you have to know what the rules are to know when and how it's powerful to break them. And so this was I was not coming in as just the guy who didn't care about the rules. Right. I came in as the trusted guy that more than half the people in there knew. I'd worked with them before. I knew how to do it the right way if they wanted to do it. They knew I would know how to do it. But I was saying, hey, give me a chance here. We can probably do this a little bit better. Trust me for a little bit, and if it doesn't work, we'll just back out. I wasn't there to screw things up. I wasn't ignoring the rules out of my own convenience. I was giving them a tool to try to help them through a jam.
So I think that having hit on trust and on building mastery so you know when to do which thing, it feels like we should end on that, because I don't think we can get any better than that in terms of our questions we started with around how to launch a project, which is really how to run a project. So any objection to wrapping up on that high note? I think that was I think we got where we needed to be. Say again?
Sounds good.
I move to dismiss.
Okay, well, we will see everybody in a couple of weeks. Thank you all for joining us.
Move to adjourn. Yep. See you later.